Hi, everyone, and welcome. So just really quickly in terms of the format, we're going to have the panelists share their experience and insights for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. So before we get started, I just want to introduce myself and I'll have the panelists introduce themselves. I'm Dr. Katrina Graham. I'm an associate professor of management here at Suffolk University. And I research and teach topics around leadership, interpersonal interactions in the workplace, and I teach a course called Managing Difficult People at Work, which is something that almost everyone can relate to and will relate to what we talk about today. Because difficult conversations are such a key part of our lives, our work lives. So many of you are entrepreneurs, you have your own business, you know how difficult it can be to work with lots of different stakeholders. So I'm hopeful that today's session can provide you with some new insights and tools. And I'm sure many of you also have some really great experiences you can connect with what we discuss. I'm also the director of our master's program in management and organizational leadership. We're proud to be one of only 2 programs in Boston that offer an immersive in-person master's program in leadership like ours. It's a 30-credit program, and we cover topics like this. And at the end, as my great associate director, Aki, mentioned, we have some flyers, some handouts, if you or anyone you know might be interested. So I'll go ahead and let the panelists introduce themselves so they can tell you their names, a little bit more about their current roles and experience. I'll start with you, Hillary, if that would be okay.
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. My name's Hillary Palmer. I'm an executive director at a recruiting firm in Boston called 7-Step. I've been in, and I'm also an MBA student here at Suffolk currently, and I took the managing or having difficult conversations in the workplace with Katrina in the spring, and it was a great class, which was really applicable to the work that I do. I've been in a people manager role for the last 5 years, and I manage and lead teams of 30 to 50 people, and difficult conversations come up all of the time, and it's really nice to kind of have that foundational coursework to apply to everyday life.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Joya Smith. I serve as the Vice President for Diversity, Access, and Inclusion here at Suffolk University. I've been in this role now about 6 years and in higher ed for 20 plus years. I probably shouldn't say that. I tell people often that I went to college and never left. My work has been around DEI when it was called Multicultural and International Student Services. And I am grateful to have had that foundation to do work in the space and then to see it evolve to where it is now, where we're really focusing on building community, encouraging cultural exchange, and all of those great things. So I look forward to talking to you about these hard conversations.
Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Gregory Beaver, and I am an assistant professor here at Suffolk. I teach an undergraduate course called Managing Across Differences and a graduate level course in the MMOL program about building inclusive organizations. My research is broad. My dissertation was on employee resource groups. So you may be a member of one or have them at your company. But I've also done some research around age and retirement and colorblind versus multicultural ideologies at work. So that's really my passion. I'm very happy to be here, so thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Before we get started, I just want to give a little brief introduction to sort of what we're going to be talking about today. As I mentioned, right, these difficult conversations are such a part of our work lives. And I always like to say that there's always new skills we can learn. I'm still learning new things every day. And my hope through this panel is that it will help give you even more confidence that you can do this, right? We'll talk a little bit about sometimes we avoid difficult conversations. We don't want to have that confrontation, but we're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. The more we learn and practice and get experience, the better we get at this. And I also want to say, too, there's not always easy answers. You know, just like many on this panel, we often have people come to us with problems. And I always say every situation is unique and different, and there may not always be an easy answer, but the more tools and skills you can develop around this, the more frameworks you have, the better able you are to approach a really thorny or tricky interpersonal issue. So my hope is through these answers, you feel like you come away from this session with some new insights and thoughts around how you approach tough conversations, as well as the important topic of inclusivity. How can we be inclusive and have everyone have a sense of belonging when we're talking about hard things? So that's sort of the takeaway I hope you get at the end of the session. And I have a series of questions I'll be asking the panelists. We'll just go in order, they'll answer. And like I said, hold your questions if you don't mind until the end. We're going to start off the first question I have for the panelists. I'll start with Greg this time, Greg, Joya, and then Hillary. What would you say are some of the biggest challenges or hurdles to people having these hard conversations in the workplace or in their businesses? In other words, what do you see as getting in our way of having effective conversations that are tough to have? So I'll start with you.
I think emotions is probably the toughest part of it. I mean, people react to difficult topics differently, and a lot of it is based on emotion. So I think the first step is really to understand that we all have different feelings about these topics, and to not jump on your first emotional reaction to a topic, but instead to kind of approach it a little bit more cautiously. So in the classroom, I mean, we have a lot of topics in my classes that touch on emotions, and maybe some people have different opinions about different diversity topics in the classroom. And I think that's the hardest part for me, is to not say something that's coming from my emotional center, to try to take a deep breath and think about it first.
So I like to follow that up and share that relationship dynamics play a role sometimes in the barrier or the challenge when you're communicating on a difficult topic. Your dynamic could be strained because perhaps, one person is the supervisor, someone is the employee. It could be a student-professor situation. It could be people who just don't know each other very well. Thinking about the rapport that's been built between people in their relationship or interpersonal connections that they have or don't have, that can be a hindrance to a conversation. Something else that comes to mind for me are time constraints. When I think about the topic and the timeliness of addressing it, there are times when you think about, oh my goodness, we have to disrupt this behavior right now. And there's no time to really think about it. But then there are situations where you can process a little longer, you can work through. So time is something else. And then last but not least, I would have to say location, location, location. We have become accustomed to situations where we can be virtual or we can be in person, we can be hybrid even. And there are some barriers that can creep in with those different modalities of how we interact and see each other. There are things that are lost in translation on a screen. There are things that are lost in translation in a text or even an email. So just thinking about the location of the conversation, the time, and then also the relationship.
Definitely. Something that I would also add is just the interpersonal and potential anxiety that you have about starting the conversation and thinking about what words to use, how they're going to perceive you as a leader. And I would agree with everything that's already been said, but that's something else that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you all are getting at too is something that I find really key to this is that there's a lot going on underneath the surface always, right? Our own personal history, their personal history, your relationship history, whatever's going on with the business, even the economy, the context of the conversation, and resisting that attempt. And I think Greg hit on this, like to be defensive, right? Sometimes when we enter these, we're like, I'm here to persuade you. And really taking that pause and not reacting in the moment and taking a learning mindset. How can I? And it's something that I know I've had to really develop this muscle, and I still struggle with it, is not immediately responding to what somebody's saying, especially if I disagree. And so I think what everyone's bringing is all these really important considerations and having the conversation to make sure it's a good time, place, space, that we're being thoughtful. Greg, were you going to add something?
I just wanted to follow up on that, because I've many times really put my foot in it in the classroom and jumped on my emotions. And I have to forgive myself for that, right? So I have to think, next time I'm going to do better, but this was a learning experience for me. So just not getting down on yourself for not handling it well the first time or the second time or whenever.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say each situation is different. So even if it went well the first time and you do the same thing the next time, it might not have the same result.
Yeah, it's a good point. There's a lot of areas we can't control or predict, and we might make mistakes along the way, and that we learn from it, and that's all we can ask for. So, great, thank you. All right, the second question. So we've talked in general a little bit about some barriers, but I always think it's really helpful around these topics to think about specific examples, right? Even though every situation is different. So I'm going to ask the panelists now to share and maybe an example of a conversation they've had or someone they know has had. So my question for you all is, can you give us an example and how did you approach this? And maybe that includes if you felt like you made a mistake or could have handled it differently or maybe not, and any techniques you found useful in this particular example. So if it's okay, I'll start with you, Joya, for this question.
So this is a wonderful question to ask. And how many of you have had a performance review recently? Okay, we're in good company. Sometimes those conversations can be difficult if perhaps you are the supervisor who has to share some news that maybe isn't as favorable to the employee receiving the assessment. And I will have to say I've been in that situation on both ends. And I know that those conversations can be challenging. They can be helpful if done correctly, but then again, what's being done correctly? It's all situational. So for example, in this instance, I was speaking with an employee who was struggling with Excel. I don't know if people even use Excel anymore, but that's an older software that this particular employee was having challenges with. And I was very reactive. I was a young leader at the time, and I wanted to, really push my way and say, you really have to learn this skill. You have to really learn how to use Excel. And we were having this conversation during the performance management review. And all of a sudden, I just got it. I needed to stop and really be an active listener to really understand and get all the data, get all the facts as to why this particular employee was struggling with this particular software. And what we arrived at was that this will probably never be an area where they will excel. But perhaps, if we did something else in terms of provide additional resources, not necessarily more training, but maybe have someone else in the area who could really respond to that particular responsibility, do that, and then give room for this employee to shine in other ways. So again, it really took being an active listener to not jump to conclusions and mandates on what should happen, but to really be open in this situation. And so I found those strategies to be useful.
Thank you. Hillary.
Thanks. So an example that I've been thinking about is also performance-based, but I had an employee, she was phenomenal, client loved her, metrics were amazing, but no one else really liked working with her because she wasn't very nice all of the time with the way that she asked for things to be done for her that helped her do such a good job. So it was wearing on a lot of people. So I had to have a conversation with her to let her know that you're getting excellent results, but along the way, you're kind of burning all of these bridges, which really is not an easy conversation to have. So the way that I approached it was, first, I made sure that going back to what Joy mentioned in a previous answer, we had the dedicated time and the medium that we are going to communicate. We work in a virtual environment, but was going to be face-to-face over Zoom, and that the purpose of the conversation was set ahead of time so the employee didn't feel blindsided. And then we went in to have a conversation. I think sometimes it's really easy to go in thinking that I'm going to tell this person what the problem is, what the solution is, and we're all going to leave the room and it's going to be great. But it's a conversation because the other person obviously doesn't know what they're doing is a problem. And so you need to take the time to listen to their perspective and try to figure out where they're coming from, and then try to bring them on the journey to show them where everyone else is coming from, and then think about a solution that they can do together and give them some easy steps that the next time this comes up, pause and maybe instead of telling ask, could you help me with this in this specific example? And then after, I think what's really important is a follow-up. So once you've had the conversation and everyone's agreed to what the next steps are going to be, make sure that you follow up in writing, not just to have everything documented, because that's always nice, but so that person can go back and the next time they're in a situation, they can reference, this is what we discussed and this is what I'm going to try. And then in a couple weeks from now, just ask how's it going and see maybe they have a new strategy that they figured out on their own. And that's how you can sort of help someone grow out of those difficult conversations. But you just got to remember that it's a two-sided conversation. I think that's important.
Yeah, thank you. Greg?
I've been trying to think about an example. I mean, in my class, things come up a lot that I'm pretty laid back, so I just, I kind of roll with them sometimes. But one of them that I didn't really handle well, I'll tell you about. It happened where we were talking about gender identity and we were talking about pronoun use. And a student in the front row chimed up that there are only two genders. And we were just talking about multiple gender pronoun use. So of course, emotionally, I jumped on that very quickly and I found myself I didn't handle that very well. But when I took a deep breath and I thought about it, I wanted to know more about his opinion on this. So I was taking this curious attitude. I became curious. So why are you saying that? Where is this coming from? I want to understand your perspective, those types of things. So rather than, like we'd mentioned before, to win the argument or to be right, it was more important for me in this environment to kind of understand where the student was coming from. And it actually, in that classroom, there were multiple students who had used different pronouns, and this student didn't realize that. So another tactic was that after we heard his opinion, I opened it up to the classroom. So what are some other opinions on this matter? And kind of took that burden off of me, but put it on to the students who had more to say about it, things that I hadn't myself said. So I don't know if that was the best way to handle it, but it worked in that instance.
No, I mean, I think you did a great job, Greg, highlighting, and we're going to talk about this next around inclusion, especially with group dynamics. A question I have for the panelists later is sort of individual versus group. And a theme that I heard from a lot of your answers is something that I think is a theme throughout this is curiosity, right? And collecting your information. I think don't walk into a difficult conversation. Sometimes we don't have time to prepare. We have to have it in the moment. But if we do have time, collecting our facts. I sometimes see managers and many, entrepreneurs who have so much going on, right? You have so much on your plate. We want to just move fast and fix things. But sometimes we need to slow down and pause, because the more information we have, the better decision we can make and the more productive, difficult conversation we can have. And to me, that was very much a theme. And often that is through the conversation itself and coming from a place of curiosity. So I think that you really highlighted that. And so with that theme of inclusion that Greg just mentioned, my next question for the panelists is taking this topic of difficult conversations, hard conversations. Why is inclusivity so important to this topic? And what does inclusivity mean to you? Because I think this is a term we use a lot, and it might mean different things to different people. So I'm curious to hear from the panelists, and I'll start with Hillary this time, if that's all right. So the relationship between inclusivity, difficult conversations, and what does it mean to you?
Definitely. So I think the two go hand in hand, because when you're entering into a difficult conversation, you're having that dialogue with someone that might have a different background or life experience to you. So I think it's really important to consider that is informing the behavior that you might want to be talking about, or the instance that you want to talk about with that person. And as a leader, I think it's really important that you take the time to reflect on that and then meet your employees where they are, because it's really there's the saying of like meet each other halfway, but in that leadership role, that other person might not be coming to you, so you have to go to them. And I think that's really important, especially as it relates to inclusivity, and what that means to me is just making sure that everyone's needs are met in the group, and that could look different for everyone, but taking the time to get to know what each individual person needs to be successful, I think will really be helpful in the long run for a team dynamic and creating psychological safety as well. So yeah, that's what I would think, how they relate to each other.
And psychological safety, it's a term that we use a lot in organizations, and I know in our program. But if you're not aware, it means essentially that people feel comfortable speaking up. Like, for example, the Boeing, I don't know if you all know what happened with Boeing and some of the aircraft safety concerns. If you look in that case, there were issues around psychological safety where employees didn't feel if they raised safety concerns, they would be listened to. So psychological safety is really this environment where people feel like they're safe to raise a concern or an issue, and ultimately helps organizations be more successful and higher performing. So I just wanted to clarify that term for those of you who may not have heard it. That's what we mean when we say that. So thank you, Hillary.
Thanks.
Greg?
So Hillary said something that sounded really good to me, was this idea that some people don't feel like they can raise their voice. Their voices aren't being heard, that they don't have a seat at the table and they don't belong. So I find that inclusion and belongingness kind of go hand in hand. So how do we know in organizations, how do we know if people belong? How do we know if they feel included? It's a difficult question. Some organizations rely on things like surveys or focus groups or anonymous comments, things like that. So it's really difficult to really get the understanding whether your employees feel like they belong. And it's important because they, like Hillary said, they have an experience, they have history, they have a right to be heard, just like everybody else. And in the classroom, I find it a little bit easier because we have different types of assignments. We have people raising their hands in class, or written assignments where they can be more, personable. But in organizations, I find it would probably be a little bit more difficult. So that's really the big question around inclusivity is, how do we know? How do we know that our employees belong? How do we know that they're being heard? How do we know that they have some type of opportunity to communicate what they like to communicate? So.
Thank you. Joya?
So I am glad to be going last because they've already used a lot of the phrasing that I would love to in terms of psychological safety. I think that's a valuable piece. And then also collecting the information from those who are in the community. But what I'd like to add to this particular question is that for me, inclusivity involves intentional engagement where people are able to truly, genuinely contribute to the space. And it takes a lot of work for that to happen. It takes communication on all ends for that to be established. And then it goes back to the culture of the organization. So testing it out to see what the culture is like, participating in climate surveys or pulse reflections so that you can get a sense of what's happening, but not just getting that information and doing nothing with it, but really inviting people into the conversation on how do we make this space one where people feel as though they're included so that they can share and ultimately everyone is successful.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you hit on such a key point, which is how much leadership matters, right? Like, this does start from the top. Culture starts from the top. And so to be inclusive and to create a culture of psychological safety, if you're sort of a middle manager or lower level supervisor, you can certainly do that with your own team and space, but so often people are limited by the organizational culture. And so thinking about this, like recognizing there might be some constraints organizationally, but if you're in a position of power to create an inclusive organization, there's so much wonderful employee talent you can leverage. And this applies right to external clients, to other stakeholders you're working with. It doesn't have to be just within the organization to use these approaches. So thank you. Those were great, I think, discussions of what is inclusion. And bring that a little further, right? Because I think some specific techniques can be really helpful. I know for me, I love talking about these topics, but what I find people find most impactful is, okay, so what do I do? I have a team meeting now on Friday. I have a discussion I'm going to lead. This all sounds great. How do I be more inclusive? And so my next question for the audience, and I'll start, or the panelists, excuse me, the audience can think on this too. I'll start with Greg. What are some approaches? And I know, Greg, you've already mentioned some. If you're advising someone who wants to be more inclusive with maybe their team or their group that they're working with, how can they approach those conversations, particularly around sort of thorny issues, as you mentioned with your class? Do you have any other techniques or advice you might give somebody who wants to do that?
So building this psychologically safe environment, I think, is important. How do you do that? You might start with ground rules in your meetings. I don't know if you have them already, but when we often meet for our diversity and inclusion panels, we have a set of ground rules where we all agree on. I'm going to use I statements, for example, rather than you. I'm going to use I statements. Other things that we can agree on. So if something does go awry in the conversation, we can bring that conversation back to those ground rules and say, look, we've agreed on these ground rules. To me, this doesn't sound like we are following these rules. So I think that's a really good place to start.
Great. Joya?
And I would just follow that up by saying, I think it's important to call in and call out, but understanding the difference. There are times when you need to call people into the conversation. They may be more of a processor. They may not need to be exposed in the moment, but you can call them in. But then calling out, sometimes, again, I mentioned this earlier, you have to disrupt in the moment. But utilizing also emotional intelligence, I think that's a skill that we can all practice. There are 5 different components to it. Just Google it and take your time and think about, self-awareness, self-reflection, interpersonal skills, all of those things. And those are things you can do today that I think will help you be successful. And one thing that I do in my meetings, I always offer an icebreaker, whether people like it or not. I enjoy asking people something to kind of ground set the conversation, even if it gets difficult a little bit later on, but it allows people to contribute up front, hopefully creating that space of psychological safety where people can hear their own voice and share something that is unique to them in the space as we get deeper into whatever the conversation. So those would be a few things that I would recommend.
Definitely. I really like the icebreaker one, so stole part of my answer. But I like to take it a little bit further. Then trying to remember some of that information that you've learned from those icebreakers, because then I like to build relationships off of that, because you can go back and say, oh, I remember you told me that you were going to do X, Y, and Z this weekend. Like, how did that go? Or the next time something comes up that's relevant in maybe like the news or something, you can share that with that person, and you're building the culture like we were talking about before. Because I think that if the team has those expectations, and also going back to what Greg was saying with the ground rules, it just makes having those conversations easier and everyone's sort of used to it. But something that I would add too is leading with empathy, and just making sure it's really hard sometimes to do it, but that you're always bringing empathy with you, and trying to think of all of the other perspectives and outside influences that creating the situation.
All great advice. And the topic of running inclusive meetings and inclusive conversations, I think we could spend hours on that. I enjoyed teaching that. So this is a really like Cliff's Notes version. I think the panelists have some really great insights. And I'll add a couple more just really, really quickly here of things you can try. To Greg's point around establishing ground rules, you can also establish roles and rotate them. So you might have a timekeeper, a facilitator, and then you stay on time, right? We've all been in meetings where the conversation runs over, you don't get to the 8 out of 10 things on your agenda. So you actually assign somebody that. And what that does, and you rotate the roles, is everybody plays a different role in every meeting. So they get a chance to be part of the team discussion in different ways. Another thing you can do, as I think this was brought up by Joya too, some people, they might need more time to think. Some people are quieter in meetings. We've all been in situations where you have more the dominant voices, maybe the more introverted participants. You can do a number of things depending on the comfort level to be more inclusive. It is making sure everybody has space to talk. You're not forcing them. But I'd be like, hey, Greg, what do you think about this issue? If he hasn't spoken yet. You can even use something called the nominal group technique. That is where everybody writes down independently their response. So we're not being affected by each other's thoughts. And so these are just some little actionable techniques that I tell folks if you're looking for sort of a really quick 2-minute advice of ways you can make your meetings and difficult conversations more inclusive. Because really part of this is inclusivity. as the panelists have mentioned, is belonging, that everyone feels like their voices are heard. So techniques that at least everyone has a chance to voice their thoughts in some form or another can just be a really great way to potentially increase inclusivity. So thank you. We've touched on this a little bit, but I think I mentioned earlier, one of the trickiest dynamics, I think, are group settings. So I'm curious to learn from the panel, if you don't mind, thinking about, if we do have a larger group discussion, what are some, especially when something tricky comes up, to Greg's point earlier, like a tricky topic or a difficult topic where there's a lot of emotions involved, how might you handle that? Or is there a different approach you would take than one-on-one? Or would you use a similar approach? So I think, who did I start with last time? Greg. So Joya, do you and I know, Joya, you are in so many different committees here at Suffolk. So you have a lot of experience with it. I've been on one with you. It's a tricky dynamic in a large group setting. Do you have any techniques you use in those types of settings?
So I think the first step in those situations is to pause. Sometimes things can go off the rails if you continue down a certain path. But I think you have to arrest the moment sometimes and say, something is coming up here that I think is causing a little tension in our conversation. And from there, making a decision, is this something that we will continue to talk through now? Or is this something that we'll come back to? But the most important piece, if you decide to come back to it, that you come back to it, that you address it. And you may need to bring in maybe a mediator or a third party, someone who's objective to kind of help work through whatever is happening. But I think as the facilitator, you have to pause in that moment. You have to really, say, okay, is this something that's going to really take us in a direction that we don't need to go in, or should we continue to walk through it? And then maybe allow for more time, because time is important. Processing is important. Sometimes we want to stop and get an answer right away. And sometimes, I prefer that in most instances, but I know that's not always the best approach. So thinking about it from that standpoint, from pause and actually acting afterwards.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
For me, when things like this come up, it's sort of reviewing the group dynamic and then just making sure that everyone is getting their voice heard. So I know this might be challenging, reading body language in a virtual setting, but I do highly encourage video, and then also creating that safe space so people feel comfortable coming as they are to the conversations, because I really do rely on facial expressions and cues. If you're on camera, you can see someone making that thinking face and maybe they're not speaking up. And obviously you want to do this tactfully, but you can say, I see that you have a thought. Do you want to share it with the group? And that way you're making sure that all of the voices are being heard. It can be really easy for someone to dominate a conversation. And then the other thing I think, going back to an answer from Greg earlier, is just having like base ground rules of just etiquette. It might seem obvious, and you might be in a professional setting, so you assume that everyone's going to operate professionally, but just, we don't cut each other off, and we let each other finish our thoughts and things like that everyone can agree to. And then if you're getting away from it, you can bring it back to the expectations that have already been set. So that's sort of how I like to mediate when we do decide that we are going to go into this right now, and make sure that it's fair for everyone involved.
Great.
So very similar ideas, but you made me think, both of you made me think of something that is true of all meetings. There's going to be another one, right? There's going to be another class. There's going to be another meeting with these same people. So you don't have to resolve an issue at the time. You can very well interrupt. You can very well take time to really process what's been going on. Maybe other people do and they haven't mentioned it to you, but you can say that. You can say, look, I need to take some time. We're going to come back to this, and then do come back to it. But I think a lot of us assume that things need to be resolved at the moment, but they really don't.
Yeah, I've learned something new from this idea. So thank you. And I really loved, Joy, you said something that she mentioned, I think you said like naming it. like naming the issue. Sometimes we want to avoid. Have you ever been in a situation and there's just like a tense conversation and we all just look away, right? But actually maybe like, I see that there is something here, there's some tension or disagreement, and then really agreeing about how to move forward. So I really like that. Like, we're not avoiding it, even though it's uncomfortable, right? Like, it's uncomfortable to be uncomfortable. But I really like that you said that, and all three of you had such great insights about how we can really mediate an effective team conversation and come back to it. So thank you. I'm going to throw a curveball at the panelists. I have not with my last question, and then I'm going to open it up for any last advice or tips from them. So they haven't had this question in advance, but I am going to start with Hillary because I know she has dealt with this. A really common thing that comes up around these topics, and I'm sure all of you have been in this situation, is sometimes we're going to have a tough conversation where there is no resolution. It's maybe delivering bad news, right? You have to break off a negotiation. Maybe you're just negotiating. If you get something, they lose something. It's a zero-sum issue. It could be even firing somebody, right? So obviously it's really hard to make people feel like they're included when that happens. So I think inclusivity is really tough, but Hillary mentioned leading with empathy. So my question for the panel, if you don't mind being thrown this curveball at you, is any tips for when it's going to be bad news, the person's not going to be happy. How can we have that tough conversation? Anything that you've learned from your experiences that you think might be helpful?
Yeah, great question. So something that I do, I'm a very direct communicator, and I do try to balance that with having empathy. But if I'm going to deliver not so great news, I'm actually thinking of a specific instance recently. When I got on the phone with one of my employees, I started by saying this isn't going to be a good conversation, because I just wanted to be upfront, and they met me with like, oh, hi, nice to talk to you. And I just wanted to like make sure that we were on the same page. And then making sure that you explain the why behind what's happening, especially if it's something out of your control, or you're coming to an impasse, like you might have to fire someone, for example, because of a performance problem you've been trying to solve. It's just not working. So you're going to be parting ways. So I think being really clear on the why, and then something else I would just add as a final thought too is making sure that you're consulting with the appropriate people prior to going into those conversations. So if you're feeling uncomfortable, maybe chatting with your boss or HR, just to get some tips about what to say compliantly and what not to say, so that you can also build that in. Because while you do want to share the why, if you have to lay off someone, for example, you might not be able to get into all of the mechanics behind it, but you want to share as much as you can, just to help make their conversation easier and help the other person understand where this is coming from. So I really don't think there's a great answer in these sorts of situations, but so sometimes it's just unavoidable.
Thank you. Greg?
This is a great question. And I'm going to take from Hillary and say, having been on the other end of it and being fired and
Not by
wondering,
Suffolk. We love Greg.
many, many years ago, but thinking about what could have gone better for me, like how could it have gone better? Because it really didn't go well. And I'm thinking what Hillary said. Yeah, I reacted with emotion, and they reacted with emotion. So there we were starting to build that, bomb up. And then they had security meet me and walk me out of the building. So it was all just very, it could have been better, I thought. So I think if you are in that situation where you have to give somebody that type of news, like Hillary said, always speak to somebody else and get some advice. Perhaps have backup outside the room, or something just in case it goes wrong. But also to give the person that space to really feel that feeling that they're going to feel. I think I felt like I didn't have the space to really be emotional at that time. And if the person that doing the firing would have said, okay, how are you feeling? You want to talk about it? I think it could have gone a lot better than it did. I hope that's the way I would be if I was the one giving that type of news. So we'll see.
So this is triggering because I've had to fire someone before and it did not go well. We had to bring in security to help move the person along. But if I could go back in time and think about how to deliver the news or just share that, things are going in a different direction, I probably would have taken time to be more prepared. I did have HR there, but the emotional piece to it. It's, empathy that you have for the person or the group that you're sharing the information with, and maybe even talking through, what happens if A happens, if B happens, so that, there are no major surprises, although each situation is different. But I think in any instance, I always promote educating yourself on conflict management strategies, mediation, facilitation skills, practicing situations before they happen, because you never know when you might have to give that bad news. And it might be something other than termination. It may be we don't have the budget this year to do A, B, and C, or we don't have the resources to do this, that, and the other. And so just, being empathetic, but then also cognizant of perhaps the emotional piece that's involved. Because again, it's about the relationship, whether it's a deep one or a shallow one. It's about making sure that we can leave a space or come to a space and have that proper exchange.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, can I add something?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Sorry, something that Greg said made me think of this. When you enter in the conversation, you have to remember it's about them and it's not about you. It's difficult for you because nobody wants to fire anyone, but you knew this was coming. You've prepared. They came to work today and thought that they were going to be employed, and now they're not. And so it's going to be much more difficult for them, even though you've maybe been thinking about this for a few days and you've been having anxiety about it. So I think trying to remember that it's about them and setting the stage for them is really important.
Yeah. All really great advice. And I think you hit on something too, that we can't control how people react, right? And to Hillary's point, like this isn't often these conversations, not making them as or letting it affect us personally while still having empathy. It can be a tricky balance, but letting people have the space sometimes to. My biggest advice when people get upset or defensive, like let them talk. Sometimes people just want that space to feel their feelings. Now, if it starts to get unsafe or you are being personally attacked, it's okay to leave that situation as well. But one thing that I think came up with all three panelists is preparation is key. We often walk in these conversations thinking, I've got it, it's fine. But doing your research before and role playing, like Joya said, practicing. I make my students, they kind of go into, we have a whole class where we role play and they think this is silly, right? But I'm telling you, like you just practicing with somebody can be really powerful in terms of what you're going to say in these conversations. So all really, really great advice. Thank you. So I'll leave it. So I'll start with Greg for this final question. Any last, as we were discussing this, any last bits of advice or thoughts you have for the audience around this topic? This really open-ended question.
I think we just need to prepare ourselves for difficult conversations. We're going to have them, and just how would you react? From my own experience in the classroom, I think, okay, this is going to happen again. These types of topics are what I teach, and therefore I'm going to get that type of reaction quite often. Well, how will I prepare myself for the next time? What will I do differently? And like I said before, not to beat myself up about how I handled it this time, but how am I going to improve my response?
Yeah, great. Joya?
So I want to say something very similar. Be patient with others, be patient with yourself, and have a growth mindset. There's something in that situation you can learn from.
Yeah, and just I think to add to that, I would say lead by example. If you're creating an environment and you're building relationships, when the difficult conversations come up, they won't be as difficult to have because you know each other and you have genuine relationships. So I would say as a leader, try to build that culture just to set everyone up for success.
I thought of one last little thing too, that is avoid gossip. right? Like what I often see is a lot of tough topics, difficult conversations, or it ends up being a lot of triangulation. This employee talked about this person or this client, and it's so easy to get in those conversations. But really find your confidants, your true people, maybe outside your organization or that you can talk to about everything going on. But within your workspace, really try to avoid doing that. When, like, if I have a conversation with Hillary, I don't want to get in a conversation about what Joya did. Like, if it needs to happen, maybe the three of us need to talk. There can be cases like that. But I think it's so, some of these interpersonal dynamics get really complicated the more people are involved, and just being really thoughtful about what you're saying to whom, and how we're thinking about our broader interpersonal interactions and networks. That would be one thing that I thought of as well. Any other follow-up to that? All right. Well, we have about 15 minutes left, so I'd love to open up to the audience for questions and answers. And these can be, by the way, this is very open.
I can help you with the mic. Just
great.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I have.
Haim Latwin, Associate Professor of Entrepreneurship here at Suffolk.
So I really enjoy most of, if not all, the people that I work with. And, from time to time when difficult conversations come up, one of the things I find is I get very stressed out beforehand. And even thinking about it and preparing for the conversations causes a lot of stress. I'm just curious what you do in the front end to deal with that, because it's a really tough thing, preparing for it.
Yeah, there's a lot of anxiety associated with these conversations, right? Yeah. I'll let the panelists volunteer. Who would like to answer? I'll give all three of you an opportunity, but who would like to go first? Any volunteers?
Well, what came to mind initially was self-care, thinking about however you take care of yourself, to maybe do that before you meet. If it's, listening to music, if it's meditating, doing yoga, going for a run, something to kind of level out your emotions, because you're already prepared, but thinking about ways that you can care for your well-being.
I know for me, not having the unknown is stressful. So preparation is helpful for me, but also I would say that if you're still kind of stressing about the conversation, don't put it off. I mean, prepare and have that time and space like we've talked about, but the longer you put it off, the more you're going to think about it and the more it's going to build up. So I feel like just having it at the right time and as soon as possible is helpful for me.
It's a hard one, Haim. I think having someone else to talk to about it will help your stress levels. You don't have to get into the details of, what the issue is, but for me, it's talking with somebody else about it.
Yeah. I'll add to this too. I think for everybody it might be different. For me, sometimes almost like not thinking about it or distracting myself with something else right before is helpful. For others, they need to think about it and process it. So you kind of find what self-care or what approach works for you. And I'll say, having known Haim for 8 years, you've gotten so much better with it. And what I'm going to say, the reason why is through experience. The more I remember having students who conducted misconduct, plagiarized or bought their papers, was very intimidating for me. I was in the Air Force too and had to give some really negative feedback, Article 15s for our airmen, and it was terrifying. But the more I did it and had that experience, the less nerve-wracking it became. And so I think just not avoiding that, and then you'll find through experience it get easier. And that's why I'd say, Haim, I think you've made great progress and we'll continue to.
We have one more here.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Kevin. Thank you for your time this afternoon. I'd like to add a couple things to the conversation. The first one is a tip that my mom gave me. She said sometimes at work, we'll get angry at colleagues and we will be hot and we'll write these nasty emails. And she was like, Kevin, please just give yourself, 24 hours before you hit send, because once it's out, it's out. And, so give yourself a chance to kind of, self-edit that stuff. And the second thing I wanted to bring up is, right now my company is small. We're in different places. So communication, I told my guys, I said, let's have a group chat so I can kind of like survey what's going on. And they were talking like different things because we have like side stuff going on. And so I just wanted to know, I guess, about kind of like documentation and, being aware of conversations going on, because we're not at a cooler in the office situation yet. So how do you deal with those like interpersonal at work situations versus like, documenting kind of emails or proposals and stuff like that? because I had to smooth things out. I was like, he wasn't saying that your website is bad. He was saying he could help you get a little further along because he's trying to. So it was like, but yeah, I don't know if that. I don't know.
No, that's such a great, I mean, I have a whole class on this, right? Like how we communicate in text and email, and especially with remote work. And in your case, right, you're virtually separated, so we have to use text and email. So your first point is 100% spot on. We have to be really careful. You're missing so many communication cues in text and email. In person, you can read their body language. We're more likely to come to a resolution and understand each other better. So you hit on like a really key issue. So I think I'll bring to the panel that question, right? How do you handle, if it's okay for me, Kevin, right? To summarize what you said and tell me if you agree that with this sort of, how do you deal with sort of interpersonal conflict or dynamics when it is over chat? How do you make sure we're communicating well and we're understanding each other, as well as how do we document? Is that a fair way to summarize? Okay.
And then also like the undocumented verbal communications that may not be as easy to track and say, you said this, but meant that. You shouldn't have said that.
Oh, I see. So
It's
the
like,
verbal, okay. And you're saying you want to document.
Yeah, like frameworks. I know there's a corporate culture we're trying to build of, and so we have certain things in place that I'm going to try and define before we get to that stage, but.
Thank you.
So I would say that in terms of like misinterpreting text or like IMs, something that I've done with employees who are, so-and-so was saying this to me and this message was really rude. I have them read it back to me out loud. And then I'm like, could you tell me like, what about that stood out to you? And sometimes like when they slow down and read it, it's really not offensive as they might have taken it, or they say, oh, I think that they meant this. And then I'm like, you think that, let's talk to the person and figure it out. So I've done that and that's worked well. In terms of documenting conversations back that you've had verbally, I like to do it as soon as the conversation's over, so that way it's fresh in your mind. And I also include some sort of statement in the email that sort of like, feel free to add in any thoughts, or if there's anything maybe that I misrepresented to let me know. And that way it's just kind of a running documentation of what we verbally agreed to previously. But I do that a lot with clients as well, so that in a week when they're like, oh no, I didn't say that, I'm like, yeah, you did.
And that's a great way. I like to, because I tell folks, try to have difficult conversations if you can in something a bit more richer, like phone, Zoom, in person, but then you have the documentation. So I like this approach that Hillary raised, where you can have the conversation, then immediately document it and share it with a person. So you can, that's one strategy I advise people. It is more work, but it could help. Greg and Joya, do you have any?
Well, I think we can go back to the guidelines again. You can have guidelines to say, okay, whatever, if there's something important that comes through on instant message, then you can say, look, we agreed that you were going to email me that important information, so I have a record of it. So even in the IM, you can just say, email that to me, so you can document it.
What about you, Joya? Anything to add?
I know, I think
think
those are great ideas. But then again, creating and crafting that system, I agree with both of you.
Hello, everyone. It's great to see Professor Katrina and Professor Greg and Hillary again. Yes, thank you, Joyce.
One of our amazing students here.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm Lum. I'm a graduate student of MMOL. This is my final semesters. So my question is about the role of emotional intelligence in when, especially in the difficult conversations or difficult decisions. So I have two questions. The first one is that whether emotional intelligence, AI, plays important role in difficult conversation, especially in difficult situation, like you are going to fire somebody, or you will put aside emotions when you have to make a hard decisions. I just give like this situation start, your employee did something good for you in the past. It means that you own him. But one day, you need to fire him. So will your decision be affected by something that he did for you in the past? Is that a kind of emotion, or you just say that business is business? That is really happens. I don't know where the US, but in Vietnam, where I come from, it really happens. You were affected by this kind of emotion kind of relationship So the boss or the leaders do care about that, and it may affect their decision whether to fire him or keep him, especially among the peers. So who's the choose who has to go?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Anyone want to volunteer to?
It's a difficult one, Lam. Cultural differences, I guess you could approach it again just when you received whatever that person did for you in the past. Try to make it understood that this has no relationship with your work relationship or however, but I think you should verbalize it if it's important to you. And I know that may not be a cultural norm, but if you can get it out in the open at the beginning, it makes it easier down the road if something should happen that you had to let them go.
And you can still be kind, right? So if you have to let someone go for a budgetary purpose and maybe they're a really great performer, you can have that empathy and have just a really like open and kind conversation. And then there's other ways that you can support that person and to demonstrate, like, I'm not just saying that in this conversation, but be a reference or whatever you can do outside of the conversation to kind of keep that relationship. I think that you have to find a balance with business, and it's not personal. This is a business decision.
As we have less than 5 minutes, I'll take one more comment and
Sure.
we
I
can
just
wrap
want
it
to
up.
answer his first part of the question too.
Oh, sorry.
I know real quickly. I don't necessarily think you need to have EQ, emotional intelligence, or be very strong in EQ to be successful at difficult conversations. I know some people with high EQ, they don't learn the skills or practice or prepare, so they don't go as well. And I've had some students who I think really struggled with their emotional intelligence, but because they prepared and they learned these skills and techniques, I do think almost anybody can learn how to have these better. That would be my answer to your first question too. Yeah.
I am wondering around those pieces of sort of tactical indicators from the other side of things. You know, we all hear that you are building off of each other, referring to each other, you credit each other's statements when you're responding within the panel. What are other kind of tactical indicators of a psychologically safe environment? What are really good things and these types of brass tacks that leaders who want to create that type of environment in their teams, within their peers, within their social groups, in their homes, you know, within their companies, can do? And then from that perspective of individuals processing differently, at what point do you, being experts, at what point does something that, that was in the heat of the moment, or somebody was sort of saying, we have a different approach to work. I'm frustrated with the way Justin Jones handled this today. At what point does something become kind of perk up to you as needs to be dealt with in a different way? This is becoming gossip. This is becoming something that is negatively influencing a team and undoing some of those tactical pieces. And what are the tactical approaches to those types of differences?
I can give some immediate thoughts, and I know the three of you have some great ones too. I love that you picked up on that, right? Like sort of that acknowledgement of people's perspectives. If you agree with something, find points of agreement where you can. I always find like wherever we can validate people, that makes people feel good. Even if you don't agree with them, really powerful ways is just paraphrase what they're saying. Like, so what I hear you saying is, like Greg was saying with that student, asking their perspective, as we've mentioned. I think to your point about heated conversations, apologizing, right? Like, I'm sorry I reacted that way. It's okay to apologize in the workplace too. It's okay to admit we have feelings in the workplace. And I think you get a really key thing, which is something that I've started teaching more, is how people react. Some of us might be a little bit more defensive or more sensitive or maybe unaware. And so getting a sense of how people react in that approach might be different, and learning their style and asking them their style, right? Like, what works for you? So that would be some just little tactical things that I've used. And it's a work in progress. But I know the three of you, what other thoughts? That's such a great question, do you think, around tactics? Any?
You've said some amazing tactics, yeah. And I think it's just valuing them, listening to them, being empathetic, putting yourself in their perspective. Where are you coming from? I want to learn more about this. Is helpful to both, comment if it's an emotional situation, but also to understand that we're all learning still. We don't know everything. Maybe there's something that I could learn from this.
I would always go back to active listening. I think Katrina, and I'm going to agree with her, mentioned it's, referring back to what was stated and rephrasing it. And if it's incorrect, allowing the person to share a little bit more and maybe even asking, is there something else that you're not sharing in this moment that we need to know? I think it's important to continue to have that conversation. But then you mentioned something about like immediate things. I think I talked about disrupting those things that are really damaging. And I think it's important for you to have a plan when it comes to that. If you're noticing that you're losing a large group of your clientele because of perhaps their interactions with an employee, you're going to have to address that, or else you might go out of business. And so, in the moment, you might have to say, we need to sit down and talk about what are your strategies in working with these clients and why are they no longer staying on? How do you bring other people into the conversation? I think, again, it really goes back to relationship, conversation, immediacy, and then finding those times when you can develop a plan and process along the way.
And just one final thing that I would add is I feel that building the individual relationships with your employees will bleed into the team dynamic, because if you're leading most of your meetings and everyone's comfortable with you, then everyone can be comfortable with each other. And I think being patient, because something that I see with a lot of new leaders that I work with is they're like, oh, so and so just is always maybe they don't have the patience to deal with whatever their quirk is. But as a leader, if that person needs 5 minutes to tell you about what their son did over the weekend, that goes a really long way, and you can give them that 5 minutes and build that relationship instead of getting frustrated with that. Just like embrace what they need, and then hopefully that will just build from there.
And I think it's okay to derail. Let's just say if something's getting derailed, like, we're going to end this. I think sometimes we want to let everyone talk and share, but sometimes it's okay to be like, this is not productive. I need to walk away. I think that's okay. And it's hard to do as a leader, but I think in the example you gave, it's okay to have ground rules around that. And I know we're out of time.
I'm very sorry,
so,
we're out of
yeah.
time, and the startup crawl is happening, and I don't want them to miss that. So thank you very much. If you guys want to